influenced fashion. It's quite interesting. So basically, a very interesting fact is how tailors in the mid-14th century modified men's silhouette during the Black Death. So we were saying that millions of Europeans died of the plague, and it had become crucial to appear in good health if you wanted to find a husband or a wife. So a tailor came up with the idea to pad the upper part of that men's outfit, that men's jacket, so that the chest would appear, you know, healthy. And so we have actually a surviving garment, as you can see. It's called a doublet. And we've got illustrations as well. This is a effigy on the left, and there's a lot of manuscripts as well showing the aristocracy of Europe. And they all have that kind of upper torso, which is padded. And on the right, you have a historical reconstruction. So basically, it's the first example of how fashion adapted to that crisis, the Black Plague. What is fascinating as well is that fashion as we know it, which is a phenomenon where, you know, you've got fashion changes and it's driven by novelty and all that. Fashion appeared in France in the mid-14th century, so at the exact same time as the plague. There's no connection between, you know, these two events, shall we say, but it's quite interesting that, you know, fashion survived, you know, that pandemic. So if we move on in time, we're going to find other crisis in, you know, related to public health. We've got the smallpox, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the French aristocracy, women started to wear small dots of black velvet and or taffeta on their faces. Everybody used to think that these small dots that we call mouches in French were to offset the whiteness of women's complexion. But actually, it is believed that the origin of the mouche was to cover the marks left on the faces by the smallpox, a virus that killed thousands of people every year. So it's interesting to see that that fashion behavior started to cover the marks left by that smallpox, and then it became progressively a fashion behavior, fashion practice that women, and even women who had never had the smallpox, would apply to their faces. And of course, we all have heard of the Spanish flu. We associate the year 1918 to the Spanish flu, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. What we know is that, first of all, it infected 500 million people, and it killed possibly up to 100 million people. So that would be the deadliest pandemic in human history. There are different theories as to the origin of the flu. Some scientists say it came from China. Others say that it's a young American soldier that brought that to Europe when the United States joined the war in 1917. Others say that it started in the trenches. But one thing is sure, it has nothing to do with Spain. Now we think that the Spanish flu most probably started around 1915, and it peaked during the First World War, and in the 20s, there was a fourth wave. It went on and on, until the mid-20s. As you can see on these two pictures, the population across the world were ordered to wear masks and avoid crowds, exactly like now. In the UK and in the US, you could pay a very heavy fine or even end up in jail for not wearing a mask. But we also know that in San Francisco, an anti-mask league was formed in 1919 on the basis that it infringed on civil liberties. So a petition was circulated and signed by members of the general public, but also by doctors and health experts. So they signed a petition to have the mask requirement lifted, and it was lifted. So there you go. Right. Part of the crisis are these ruptures, these events that are related to public safety, and that includes the wars and the revolutions. So I will now start to talk about, I'll have a look at the two wars and how the fashion industry had to adapt to these major crises. So the First World War began in 1914 and ended in 1918. We know that women were forced to replace men at work, but there's a little bit more to it. So basically, what is the context behind all this? First of all, since the 19th century, societies in the West were industrialized. So when all the men of Europe were sent to fight in that First World War, it was impossible to stop the industries, the manufacturers. So basically, women had to replace them. So on the left, we see a dress from 1913, 1912. So basically a few years before the outbreak of the war. We notice that the dress is long, the skirt is narrow. Would have been very difficult for women to replace men at work dressed like that. Just imagine having to climb stairs. And so women were not only working in manufacturers and industries, they were also conducting buses, controlling trams, and so on. So it was, things had to change. So overnight, women were dressed in more practical garments. So the illustration in the center shows a dress, a suit from 1915, and it shows the new silhouette adapted to the work of women. So you have a skirt or dress that is now mid-calf length and is a lot wider, enabling women to move more freely. But if you look at that illustration, you're going to see that woman clearly is from the upper class. She doesn't look like she's going to work at the manufacturer. You are absolutely right. The thing is that new silhouette had been created for working class and lower middle class women. Women would go to work. But women from the upper class they also wanted to wear that new silhouette. So they would ask their tailors, their fashion designers, or their dressmakers to, create the same design for them, but in more luxurious fabrics. That system of spreading a trend is quite special. Usually you have new trends emerging from the upper class and it's trickling down the lower classes. But in that special case, it was the opposite. A new trend came from the lower classes and went up and was adopted by the upper class, and that's called trickle up. So there are a few examples like that, and some of them are associated with the war. So during the war, women would wear, classes would wear that silhouette. And on the right, what are we looking at? We're looking at a design of 1919. What happened? Well, men came back from the war. They wanted their jobs back. Women were not needed at work anymore. And they were put back into, uncomfortable and unpractical fashions. So the hemlines went down to the ankle. The skirt became narrow again. But there's one thing that never changed, the hats. If you look at that design on the left, the first one on the left, you see these wide-brimmed hats. During the war, they were not practical at all. So women, had smaller hats. And after the war, women did not want to come back to these huge hats. So these small hats remained. Right, let's talk about the trench coat. I'm sure you've all heard of Burberry. Well, Burberry used to be Burberry's. And Burberry's, before they designed fashion from the mid-90s onwards, Burberry's was a brand that catered for the upper class, the aristocracy in England, and the rest of the world as well. They provided the upper class with garments for the outdoors. So fishing outfits, yachting outfits, hunting outfits, and so on. When the war broke out in 1914, the British government asked Burberry's to create a coat for the British officers. We know that the First World War is also called the War of the Trenches, because we had, you had these kind of trenches that were dug into the earth, and this is where the soldiers were living, shall we say, and it protected them. So that was a new kind of war strategy that was experimented during the First World War. And so the coat was supposed to keep the British officers warm and dry when they were in the trenches. So Burberry's created a very waterproofed coat with big pockets, easily accessible, and with a collar that could be unfolded to cover the head. So it became known as the trench coat. After the war, Burberry thought, why don't we sell the trench coat to women? And I found this ad in the Vogue of 1919, and it advertises the trench coat for women by Burberry's. So it's very interesting because it's a very early example of a fashion for women that was practical and comfortable, and it came from the war. So with the trench coat and also that silhouette that we saw during the war, we're getting that new concept of a comfortable, practical, but elegant fashion for women. And isn't it that the definition of modern fashion? So we'll come back on that later when we go to the 1940s. On the right, we have an example of knitwear. That woman is wearing an outfit made of knitwear. During the First World War, all the manufacturers of Europe were producing for the war, we know that, but the fabric manufacturers were concentrating on producing woolens for the armies. So by the end of the war, these fabric manufacturers were left with tons of yarn. And they thought, why don't we offer woolens for women to women's wear? And we see an increasing use of woolens in women's wear from that period onward. So it gave a kind of very, very soft outlook, because if you think about it, it's the fabric that dictates the shape. So now I'm going to talk about Gabrielle Chanel during the 20s. Yes, we are in the 20s, but it's the aftermath of the war. You have to understand that in Europe, each family of Europe had at least lost one member. So, and basically, the whole of the 20s were a consequence of the First World War. On the left, you see a mourning ensemble. Mourning was worn basically after you had lost somebody from your family. People in the Western world would wear black and for a year, and then gray for another year. And we see a lot of these outfits, not only in the aftermath of the war, but throughout the 20s as well. So it's quite interesting that Gabrielle Chanel decided to create the little black dress in 1926. So basically, she created a revolution. Let me explain that. First of all, one thing you need to know about Gabrielle Chanel: everything she created to make her life easier. She was a woman designing for women. She would wear her own designs. She tested her own design. She was very busy. She was running a fashion house in the 20s. She already had 4,000 employees. She would go to business meetings. She would go out in the evening. And she didn't always have the time to go back to the Ritz where she lived to change. And so she thought, I need a uniform. I need a garment that I could wear every day at work, to go to do fittings, to go to business meetings, and then I could accessorize it and I could go out in the evening. And she created the little black dress. So the little black dress is an example of utilitarian functionality, a design that is based on the need of the wearer. And the whole aesthetic is based on the needs, on the function of the garment. So she chose black because if you think about it, it won't show the stains. So you don't send your little black dress every day to the dry cleaner. So basically, you have to put that dress into the context of 1926. As I said, people were still mourning for their loved ones. And God knows that women had enough wearing black. And there she was, proposing black as a fashionable color. So she was taking the color black that had been associated with death for such a long time. And she was basically moving it into another context, changing the meaning and the symbolism of the color. So it's quite interesting. It is believed that Paul Poiret was the designer of the pre-war period. He is the designer that created the first luxury fashion brand. It is the designer that invented fashion branding. And he was celebrated and he had, a lot of clients. But after the war in the 20s, women had changed. And he was associated with the pre-war period. So he was not very popular anymore in the 20s. And it is believed that he met Chanel. And of course, Chanel was, the fashion designer of the 20s. It is believed that he met Chanel and she was wearing her little black dress. And he said, "Are you going to a funeral, mademoiselle?" And she said, "Yes, monsieur, to yours." Meaning, you're dead, you're finished. The fashion editor of American Vogue of the time called the little black dress the Ford, the Model T Ford, because she saw it as a garment that was a symbol of democratization of fashion. And the color black became from that moment onwards fashionable color. And after Chanel, all the fashion designers included black in their collections. Oops, we have another crisis here. So it has nothing to do with the war. It's the crash of the stock market in 1929, October 1929. So basically, as you see here on that page of the newspaper, billions lost in New York crash. So we know that a lot of people lost all their money, a lot of people lost their jobs. And it began the Great Depression in the United States, and the repercussions were worldwide. It also had major consequences on the fashion industry. So basically, all the orders coming for garments, for collections, coming from the United States were canceled overnight, and thousands of workers in the French fashion industry were laid off. So what happened is that how did the major fashion brands survive? It's something that we're talking about right now. So the big names such as Chanel, Lanvin, Patou, Madeleine Vionnet were able to sustain the depression because they had made a lot of money in the 1920s, but a lot of smaller fashion houses had to close. It is known that Chanel had to cut her prices by 50%. And of course, what they did is that they simplified their designs. They got rid of all the embellishment techniques such as embroideries and lace. These are costly. But, by 1938, French fashion was thriving again. So the same thing could happen today, to the fashion brand. In the 30s, you've got the Depression, but you also have the rise of fascist governments in Europe, which promoted very conservative values. And it had an impact on fashion as well. As you can see on the right, the hemlines went down again to mid-calf. And we've got now the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. This is a shocking photograph because it shows Rue de Rivoli and with the Nazi flags. As you know, France was occupied by the Germans from 1940 to 1945. And what happened to the French fashion industry during those years? Well, there's a very touching story that I'd like to share with you because not a lot of people know about that. One of Hitler's dreams was that Berlin would become the world's fashion, the world center of fashion. Paris had been the center of fashion, but Hitler wanted Berlin to become that, to get that status. So he sent people to talk with the president of the Chambre syndicale, which is an organization in charge of the fashion industry, still exists today. So he sent one of his ministers to the Chambre syndicale, and the plan was that 30,000 workers from the French fashion industry would be transported, would be sent to work camps near Berlin, and there they would train the Germans on how to design and create haute couture. So the president of the Chambre syndicale was quite concerned because he thought these 30,000 people who are going to be sent to the camps, their families in Paris will be without any source of income. And also, once they have finished training the Germans, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be sent back to Paris, or are they going to be kept prisoners? So he thought that he needed to try something, and he went to Berlin and he had a meeting. He managed to get a meeting with Hitler, and he said to Hitler that if the workers were left in Paris, all the fashion designers would work for the Germans. And Hitler agreed. So the president went back to Paris, the 30,000 people remained in Paris, the French designers worked for the Germans, but one thing you need to know, only 200 German women bought French haute couture. So it's not that a big number. But these French designers and that president, with his decision, they saved the livelihood and most probably the lives of 30,000 of their co-workers. So that is a very, very touching and moving story about the German occupation of France. So yes, the fashion designers continued to work, but as we know, the French manufacturers were working for the German army, so very little fabric was left for the civilians. And it's not surprising, as you can see on the slide, that there's no new silhouettes during the war. So that's a 1940. This is a suit by Nina Ricci in the center, and on the right, it's the House of Worth. So it's the same silhouette. Actually, that silhouette with the very square, strongly padded shoulders was there in 1938. So nothing changed from 1938 to 1947. So what about French women during the German occupation? if you were in Paris, it was quite hard because the Germans were there. They had chosen Paris as their headquarters. So the city was full of German officers and soldiers. So people were watched constantly. And as you know, the Germans controlled French economy, and to be sure that the civilians had very little, each person was given a booklet with stamps or coupons, and you had enough coupons to buy one new dress per year, one coat per year, maybe 5 pair of socks, and so on. So if something happened to your dress, or you wanted another one, you had to recycle. Of course, there were no coupons to go to the hairdresser, so women could not have their color done, a little bit like us today. So after they tried beet juice or carrot juice, some women started to wear turbans outdoors. That was quite revolutionary because all the women of the Western world used to wear turbans when they were cleaning their houses to keep the dust from messing their hair. So it was something you would wear inside your house, but never outdoors. But because no hairdresser, during the war, women started to wear turbans outside. So it's a trend that was created, out of need. And, I don't know, maybe it's going to happen to us soon. But it is said that after the war, French women never wanted to wear turbans outside. It was a reminder of a very, very difficult period. Right, let's come to London now. On the right, you have a fashion shoot from Vogue. It's Vogue UK, Vogue London, and it's a very poignant fashion shoot. You know that England was not invaded, but they were bombed every night for 3 months. That's the Blitz. And basically, you would go to bed, and then during the night, you would hear the sirens, and you had a few minutes to jump out of bed, run to the nearest underground station, and you would spend the rest of the night on the platform with hundreds of other people. And in the morning, you would go out, and this is what you would find. It could be your neighbor's house, it could be your house, it could be the house of elderlies who didn't have time to leave. So it was a very, very difficult site, a very difficult period for the English. And here you have that fashion model, looking at the rubbles of what used to be, a building. So it's a very, very poignant image, very famous. So on the left, we see a scheme that was created by the British government to encourage women to recycle, to make do and mend. So basically, of course, all the fabric manufacturers of England were busy producing for the British Army, and the spending of the civilians was also controlled. So people had the same booklets, with coupons and stamps, and you had enough stamps to buy one dress a year and so on. So, the make do and mend was basically to boost morale. Women did not need to be told how to recycle because women used to do it, and they continued to do it for decades. But it was a way to boost morale. Very important. Time flies. I hope I will have time. Let's go to United States during the Second World War. I'd like to talk about the buyers. So who were buying the fashion designs from Paris? The buyers. And who were the buyers? They were from United States. One thing you need to know is that without American money, French fashion would have never survived, never evolved. So basically 99% of the buyers were Americans. They worked for American department stores, American manufacturers, and they would go to Paris during the Paris Fashion Weeks, and they would buy the rights to copy the designs. So you were a French designer, you would create a collection for your private clients, but you would also create a collection for the buyers, because you didn't want these markets. So the American buyers would come to Paris twice a year, and as I said, would buy the copyrights. And then they would go back, they would leave with a kind of prototype, and they would go back to New York, and these designs would be mass produced for the American market. But during the Second World War, the American buyers could not cross the Atlantic. Even in a submarine, it would have been really, really dangerous. So for the whole duration of the war, the American buyers had no idea what was being designed in Paris, because yes, you still had fashion magazines being published in France, but they were published in France. They were not distributed outside France, of course. So actually, no one in the world had an idea of what being designed in Paris. So for the first time ever, the American buyers, they had to rely on their own homegrown designers. And for the first time ever, American designers didn't have to copy Paris anymore. They were able to design an American fashion for American women. And American women were really different from European women who were buying haute couture. American women, even the wealthiest one, came from humble backgrounds. And even with a lot of money, their lifestyles were still very casual. So I'd like to talk briefly, because we don't have much time left, about a girl. Yes?
Yeah, I think we're running out of time. We have 10 minutes left. So do you prefer to start like opening to questions, or you want to talk a little bit more and we cut at, we have 10 minutes left only.
Well, I will go very, very quickly into Claire McArdle. I just want to say that her designs were extremely avant-garde, they were minimalist, and therefore timeless. You could put that in the shops today. And they were designed during the 40s. And then you have, well, I could stop there. I was going to talk a little bit more, but I can stop there, you know, when the war finally was over. And we can take the questions if you want.
Let's, do you want to take off the screen so
yes.
that you can share the questions with everybody? Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. For me, I could continue listening for you for hours and hours. I think there are so many similarities. Put your camera, Suzanne, so we can see you, please. I think there are so many answers to what we are happening. So what we are living right now, the situation. So it's incredible. So the questions that we are having from people is basically, what do you think about? Let me read this question about today's situation. How? What do you think will be the impact in big brands in this isolation we are now living?
Well, first of all, I am a fashion historian, so I'm not an expert in marketing, fashion marketing or branding. But if I look at the past, I think fashion will bounce back. It has always bounced back. It might be transformed. We already see designers taking that moment, that hiatus in the fashion industry to ask for reform of the fashion industry. And we saw the designer of Gucci, we saw Dries van Noten as well, and others writing letters asking for reduction in the number of collections. Let's see how the big brands, the conglomerates such as LVMH and Kering and Richemont will respond. They have the money to sustain, they have the budget to sustain, but smaller brands, it's going to be difficult. Mm-hmm. So it's the great unknown.
Suzanne, many brands are coming up with that they are going to cut the collections to twice a year. Do you think this will be a trend for the future?
It can stay like that because of the world's economy. The economies all over the world are greatly impacted. And I think the market will have changed. A lot of people will have less money to buy. Even the upmarket, people who buy luxury fashion will be more circumspect about what they buy. We saw the same thing happening after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2008, the beginning of that big crisis. And we saw that big fashion houses, in order to sustain that crisis, they started to create minimalist collections in which the costs are reduced and also the clients can buy one outfit which is going to last, more than a year. So that could happen. And also, if you look at the beginning of the 90s, 1991, it's the Gulf War, and then you have a global recession, and a lot of brands started to go into minimalism. So I think that could happen. That will come back. Minimalism in fashion design.
Well, that was one of the questions, if you think that this is the beginning of minimalism. So it's my next one. And thank you very much for anticipating. Another thing about the trends, because we see that after certain crises and different ruptures in the past, trends, the way we dress change. Do you think that now, this is one of the questions, do you think that now like the trends will go for a long term? For example, gloves. Do you think we will go back and start using